The moment Naomi glanced at the billionaire's laptop, she noticed a flaw his entire team of engineers had missed. Everyone in the penthouse believed Naomi Brooks was just another maid. She wore a yellow hoodie, cleaned quietly, and never spoke unless spoken to. To billionaire Richard Caldwell, she was simply part of the background, someone who polished the glass tables and disappeared before the guests arrived. But one unexpected moment would reveal a truth no one in that room could have imagined. Because the quiet young woman wiping the floors was hiding a mind capable of saving a billion-dollar company and changing 2 lives forever. The first light of a cold Manhattan morning slid between the towers of glass and steel, painting the upper floors of the city with pale gold. 40 stories above the noise of traffic, and a penthouse window reflected the rising sun like a mirror. Naomi Brooks stepped out of the elevator with a small canvas cleaning bag resting against her hip. Her sneakers were worn but clean. The yellow hoodie she wore looked out of place against the polished marble hallway and the soft glow of designer lights. The air smelled faintly of expensive cologne and polished wood. She paused for a moment, glancing down the quiet corridor of the luxury building on East 72nd Street. Through the tall windows at the end of the hall, she could see Central Park stretching like a dark green shadow beneath the skyline. Naomi pulled her hoodie sleeves down over her hands and took a slow breath. This was her 3rd week working for the cleaning service. Usually she was assigned small apartments or offices after business hours, in places where nobody really noticed her. But this address was different. Penthouse 40A. The service manager had told her the night before. "A billionaire lives there," he had said, almost whispering the word as if it carried weight. "Just keep your head down, do your job, and don't touch anything that looks expensive." Naomi had smiled politely on the phone. Almost everything looked expensive in places like this. She knocked gently on the door. A moment later it opened just a few inches before stopping against a security chain. A pair of sharp gray eyes studied her. "Yes?" the man behind the door said. Naomi spoke softly. "Good morning, sir. I'm Naomi from Bright Home Cleaning." The chain slid back. The door opened wider. Standing in the doorway was a tall, older man in a tailored navy suit. His silver hair was neatly combed, and in his expression carried the calm authority of someone used to being obeyed. This was Douglas, the head house manager. His eyes moved from Naomi's shoes to the hoodie to the cleaning bag. A quick, silent inspection. "You're new," he said. "Yes, sir." Douglas stepped aside reluctantly. "Don't wander through the apartment. Stay in the kitchen and the guest rooms unless told otherwise." Naomi nodded. "Yes, sir." She stepped inside. The penthouse opened before her like something out of a movie. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the entire city. A grand piano rested near the glass wall. Sculptures stood on polished stone pedestals. The living room was larger than Naomi's entire apartment back in the Bronx. The silence inside the space felt almost sacred. Douglas walked ahead of her. "Mr. Caldwell is recovering from a medical situation," he said. "He doesn't like noise." Naomi nodded again. "Understood." Douglas stopped near the kitchen entrance. "You'll begin here." He handed her a pair of gloves. "And please remember, everything here costs more than your annual salary." He turned and walked away without another word. Naomi watched him disappear down the hallway. For a moment she stood there quietly. Then she set her bag on the counter and began working. The kitchen alone looked like it belonged in a magazine. Stainless steel surfaces, imported stone countertops, cabinets that closed without sound. Naomi wiped each surface slowly, carefully. Outside the tall windows, Manhattan was waking up. Yellow taxis moved like tiny toys in the streets below. Steam rose from subway grates, and she could hear faint sirens somewhere far away. While she worked, she hummed softly to herself, an old church song her mother used to sing when Naomi was a little girl. Back then, life had been different. Her father had worked construction. Her mother had worked maintenance at a hospital. They had never been rich, but they had always had enough. Until the accident. Naomi pushed the memory away and kept cleaning. About 20 minutes later, footsteps echoed across the hardwood floor behind her. She turned. A tall man stood in the doorway of the kitchen. He was older, late 60s perhaps, but carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades in control. His dark sweater hung loosely on his frame, and a faint scar near his collarbone peeked from beneath the fabric. Richard Caldwell, a billionaire founder of Caldwell Systems, one of the most powerful technology investors in New York. Naomi recognized him instantly from the business magazines she sometimes read during her night shifts at the bus terminal. Richard studied her silently. His eyes paused on the yellow hoodie, then on the cleaning cloth in her hand, finally on her face. "You're the new maid?" he asked. His voice was calm but distant. "Yes, sir," Naomi said. Richard nodded slowly. For a moment he looked like he wanted to say something else. But instead, he simply turned toward the refrigerator and poured himself a glass of water. Naomi went back to wiping the counter. The room filled with quiet again. After a few seconds, Richard spoke. "You're young." Naomi looked up. "Suppose so. Most people your age don't work mornings." Naomi gave a small smile. "Most people my age probably don't have hospital bills waiting at home." Richard didn't respond. He took a sip of water and walked toward the living room. But as he reached the doorway, he paused. Something about the way Naomi worked caught his attention. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't clumsy. Her movements were careful, deliberate, like someone used to paying attention to details. He watched for another moment before leaving the room. Naomi finished cleaning the kitchen and moved into the living room. Sunlight poured through the massive windows, casting long lines of gold across the floor. Dust particles floated in the air like tiny stars. She wiped the piano carefully, adjusted a stack of books. Then she noticed something strange. On the side table near the couch sat an old radio, the kind people used decades ago. Its wooden frame was scratched and worn. One of the knobs was loose. Naomi tilted her head, curious. She gently turned the knob. Nothing happened. The radio was broken. She crouched down and examined the back panel. Her father used to repair small electronics when she was a child. Radios, microwaves, old televisions people threw away. He had always told her, most things in this world just need patience. Naomi reached into her bag and pulled out a small screwdriver. Just then, footsteps returned. Richard stood behind her again. "What are you doing?" he asked. Naomi froze slightly. "I'm sorry, sir. I noticed the radio wasn't working." Richard frowned. And? "I thought I might try fixing it." "You repair electronics?" "A little." Richard folded his arms. For a moment he looked almost amused. "This radio is older than you." Naomi smiled. "Sometimes the old ones are easier to fix." Richard didn't stop her. He simply watched. A minute later, Naomi adjusted a loose wire inside the panel and turned the knob again. A crackle filled the room. Then soft jazz music drifted through the speaker. Richard blinked. He hadn't heard that radio work in years. Naomi stood and wiped her hands on a cloth. "There you go," she said gently. Richard looked at her again. Longer this time. The girl in the yellow hoodie. The maid from the Bronx. The one Douglas clearly didn't trust. Yet somehow she had just fixed something none of his technicians had bothered with. Richard finally spoke. "You're not like the others." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "I'm not?" Richard shook his head slowly. "No." Outside the window, the city roared awake, and somewhere deep in Richard Caldwell's mind, a quiet question began to form. Who exactly was the maid in the yellow hoodie? Because something told him this young woman cleaning his floors was far more than she appeared, and he had no idea that the answer to that question would soon change both of their lives forever. But Naomi Brooks didn't know any of that. By the time the afternoon sun began sliding behind the towers of Manhattan, she had already finished polishing the last glass table in the penthouse and quietly packed her cleaning supplies back into the canvas bag. Douglas barely looked at her as she walked toward the elevator. "Same time tomorrow," he said stiffly, checking something on his tablet. "Yes, sir," Naomi replied. The elevator doors closed with a soft whisper. As the numbers slowly counted down from 40 to the lobby, Naomi leaned her head back against the wall and exhaled. Her feet ached, but she didn't complain. She had worked longer hours for far less. Outside the building, Manhattan pulsed with late afternoon energy. Black SUVs idled along the curb. Men in suits rushed across the street while talking into phones. The smell of roasted coffee drifted from a cafe on the corner. Naomi pulled the hood of her yellow sweatshirt over her head and started walking toward the subway station. From the outside, the city looked powerful. But the farther north the train carried her, the more the skyline slowly changed. Glass towers turned into older brick buildings, when luxury storefronts became laundromats, discount markets, and neon signs flickering above small takeout restaurants. When Naomi stepped out of the subway in the Bronx, the air felt colder. A bus roared past the corner, its brakes squealing. Someone played music loudly from a passing car. Streetlights buzzed as they flickered on for the evening. This was the world Naomi knew. She walked 2 blocks to the bus stop near 183rd Street and sat on the metal bench, resting her bag beside her. The bench was scratched with years of graffiti and worn smooth by countless commuters. Across the street, a small grocery store glowed beneath buzzing fluorescent lights. Naomi rubbed her hands together to warm them. The cold didn't bother her much anymore. Growing up here had taught her how to endure things, and a few minutes later, an elderly man approached the bus stop, moving slowly with the help of a cane. Naomi recognized him instantly. "Mr. Carter?" she said, with a warm smile. The old man looked up, surprised, then chuckled softly. "Well, look at that! Naomi Brooks. You're out late tonight." "Doctor's appointment," he said, lowering himself carefully onto the bench beside her. "These old bones need more repairs than your electronics." Naomi laughed. "How did the appointment go?" "Doctor says I need to rest more." He shook his head, but I told him rent doesn't rest. Naomi reached into her bag and pulled out a small brown paper package. "I brought you some soup from the church kitchen," she said. Mr. Carter's eyes widened. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Naomi replied gently. He accepted the container, bent his hands trembling slightly. "You're too kind, Naomi," he said quietly. She shrugged. "My mom always said if you have something warm, you should share it." Just then, Naomi's phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen. Bronx General Hospital. Her stomach tightened. "Hello?" she answered quickly. A calm voice spoke on the other end. "Miss Brooks, this is Nurse Alvarez calling about your mother." Naomi straightened. "Is she okay?" "She's stable," the nurse said carefully, "but the cardiologist reviewed her tests today." Naomi held her breath. "She'll need surgery." For a moment, the sounds of the street seemed to fade away. The passing cars, the distant music, even the rumble of the approaching bus. "How soon?" Naomi asked quietly. "Sooner is better," the nurse replied. But we understand it's expensive." Naomi swallowed. "How much?" There was a pause. "About $60,000. The number hung in the cold evening air like a weight. Naomi thanked the nurse and ended the call. She stared down at the cracked pavement. 60,000. It felt like someone had just asked her to climb the Empire State Building with bare hands. Mr. Carter studied her face. "Everything all right, child?" Naomi forced a small smile. "Just hospital stuff." He nodded slowly. He understood more than she said. The bus pulled up with a loud hiss of brakes. They climbed aboard together. Naomi rode only 2 stops before stepping off again near a small brick church on a quiet side street. Light spilled from the basement windows. Inside, volunteers moved between folding tables filled with soup pots and trays of bread. The smell of tomatoes and garlic filled the air. "Naomi?" someone called. A middle-aged woman in an apron waved from the kitchen. "Pastor Williams said you worked all day. You should be resting." Naomi tied an apron around her waist anyway. "I can rest later." She grabbed a ladle and began filling bowls for the line of people waiting along the wall. Some were elderly. Some were single parents. Some were men who had clearly spent the night sleeping outside. Naomi greeted each one with the same warm smile. "Here you go. Stay warm tonight. Let me know if you need more bread." An hour passed quickly. Just as the last bowl was served, Naomi stepped outside to throw away a trash bag. The night air was colder now. When across the street, a black sedan had stopped at the red light. Inside the car sat Richard Caldwell. He had spent the evening visiting an investor downtown and had taken a wrong turn through unfamiliar streets. While waiting for the light to change, his eyes drifted toward the church building. Through the basement window, he saw Naomi. She was laughing with a group of children as she handed them bowls of soup. Her yellow hoodie was the same one she had worn that morning in his penthouse. Richard leaned forward slightly. "What is she doing here?" he murmured. The light turned green, but he didn't move. Instead, he watched through the window as Naomi knelt down beside a small boy who had dropped his spoon. She wiped the table, gave him a fresh bowl, and gently patted his shoulder. No cameras, no applause. No expectation of anything in return. Just quiet kindness. The car behind him honked loudly. Richard blinked and finally drove forward. But something stayed with him as the city lights blurred past his windshield. The maid in the yellow hoodie, fixing old radios, serving soup in church basements, helping strangers like it was the most natural thing in the world. And for the first time in a long time, Richard Caldwell found himself wondering about someone who worked for him. Who exactly was Naomi Brooks? Because something about her story still didn't add up, and the truth waiting beneath it was far more complicated than either of them could imagine. The next morning, Manhattan woke beneath a gray sky. Cold wind swept between the buildings, rattling the metal grates above the subway entrances. The office workers hurried along the sidewalks with coffee cups and scarves wrapped tight around their necks. Inside the Caldwell penthouse, the morning was quiet. Too quiet. Richard Caldwell sat near the massive living room window, looking down at the tiny movement of the city far below. A cup of black coffee rested untouched on the glass table beside him. His doctor had ordered him to slow down. Less stress, less work, more rest. But resting had never been something Richard Caldwell knew how to do. He had built his company from nothing 40 years earlier. Endless meetings, long nights, constant decisions. His mind had always moved faster than the world around him. Now, after the heart attack, everything felt slower. And somehow the silence made his thoughts louder, especially the ones about the girl in the yellow hoodie. Not a soft knock broke the stillness. Douglas stepped into the room. "She's here again," he said. Richard turned slightly. "Who?" Douglas gave a small sigh. "The maid." Richard almost smiled. "Her name is Naomi." Douglas raised an eyebrow. "If you say so, sir." Richard said nothing more. A few minutes later, Naomi stepped into the apartment carrying her small cleaning bag again. Her yellow hoodie looked brighter in the morning light. She paused when she saw Richard already sitting in the living room. "Good morning, sir." "Morning." Douglas watched the interaction carefully from across the room, his arms folded. "Kitchen and dining area first," he told Naomi firmly. "We have guests coming tonight." Naomi nodded. "Yes, sir." She walked quietly into the kitchen and began wiping the countertops. Behind her, Aunt Douglas leaned closer to Richard. "You shouldn't get used to the help," he said quietly. Richard frowned. "What does that mean?" Douglas lowered his voice even more. "Girls like that move around a lot. Temporary workers." Richard didn't respond. Douglas continued. "And if I may say, sir, some of them look for opportunities." Richard turned his head slowly. "Opportunities?" Douglas cleared his throat. "People with your kind of wealth attract attention." Richard's eyes hardened slightly. "I've been attracting attention for decades." Douglas nodded. "Exactly." The conversation ended there, but the tension stayed in the air. A couple hours later, the apartment transformed. Caterers arrived. Waiters set crystal glasses across the dining table, and a long, polished surface reflected the skyline outside the windows like a mirror. Richard had agreed to host a small dinner for several technology investors that evening. It wasn't his idea, but the board insisted. The company's newest project was struggling. They needed reassurance. By 6 o'clock, the apartment buzzed with quiet activity. Naomi worked carefully in the background, polishing the final set of wine glasses near the bar. She moved slowly, making sure every glass caught the warm yellow light perfectly. As she reached for the last one, her elbow brushed the edge of the counter. A glass tipped, then another. One of them slid from her fingers. The sound of shattering crystal echoed across the room. Conversations stopped instantly. Naomi froze. The broken pieces glittered across the marble floor, and Douglas rushed forward. "What did you do?" he snapped. "I'm sorry," Naomi said quickly, kneeling down to collect the pieces. Douglas's voice grew sharper. "Those glasses were imported from Italy. I'll clean it up. You shouldn't even be near them." Several guests nearby had turned to watch. A woman in a silver evening dress whispered to the man beside her, "They let cleaning staff walk around during dinner?" The man chuckled quietly. "New York hospitality." Naomi kept her eyes on the floor as she gathered the broken glass. Her hands moved carefully, but Douglas's voice continued. "Honestly, some people simply don't belong in places like this." The words hung in the air. Naomi paused for half a second, just long enough for the sting to land. Then she finished picking up the glass. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said again quietly. Across the room, Richard had watched everything. He hadn't said a word. Not yet. Douglas turned toward one of the waiters. "Bring another glass." Then he looked back at Naomi. "And next time, stay out of the main room." Naomi nodded. She carried the broken pieces toward the kitchen. As she stepped through the doorway, she felt the quiet weight of every stair behind her. In the kitchen, she dropped the glass into the trash bin and washed her hands slowly under warm water. The sting in her chest was familiar. It was the same feeling she had known since she was a little girl. Teachers who assumed she wouldn't finish assignments. Store clerks who followed her through aisles. Employers who never bothered to learn her name. Naomi dried her hands on a towel and took a steady breath. Then she returned to work. In the living room, the conversation had resumed. But Richard Caldwell had not stopped thinking about what he had just seen. Something about the moment bothered him. Not the broken glass. The way Naomi had reacted. No anger, no argument. Just quiet patience. He watched her move across the room again with another tray. One of the investors leaned toward Richard. "Tough help to find these days," the man joked. Richard didn't laugh. Just then, Naomi stepped closer to the table to collect an empty plate. Before she could reach it, Richard's chest tightened suddenly. At first it was small, a sharp pressure beneath his ribs. He ignored it. But within seconds, the pain spread across his chest like a heavy weight. Richard gripped the edge of the chair. The room tilted slightly. Douglas noticed first. "Sir?" Richard tried to stand, but his legs refused to cooperate. The pressure in his chest grew stronger. Voices around him blurred together. Someone shouted, "Call 911!" Douglas looked panicked. One of the guests stepped backward. The waiters froze, and in the middle of the chaos, Naomi Brooks turned around. She saw Richard's face, pale, sweating, his breathing shallow. In that single instant, she knew exactly what was happening. And before anyone else in the room even understood the danger, Naomi moved toward him. Because the next few minutes were about to decide whether Richard Caldwell would live or die. The room had gone silent, except for the faint clink of a wine glass somewhere on the long dining table. Richard Caldwell leaned heavily against the back of his chair. His face had turned pale, and a thin layer of sweat formed along his temples. Douglas rushed forward, his voice trembling. "Sir, are you all right?" Richard tried to answer, but his breath came out shallow and uneven. The pressure in his chest tightened like a fist. A couple of the investors stood up quickly. Someone shouted, "Call an ambulance!" But in the chaos, nobody seemed to know what to do next, except Naomi. She moved forward immediately, her steps calm but urgent. "Mr. Caldwell," she said firmly. Her voice cut through the noise. Richard's eyes flickered toward her. "Can you hear me?" He nodded weakly. Naomi placed a hand gently on his shoulder and guided him back into the chair before he could collapse completely. "Sit down. Don't try to stand." Douglas stared at her. "What are you doing?" he demanded. Naomi didn't even look at him. She was already focused. "Did your doctor prescribe nitroglycerin?" she asked Richard. His breathing was rough, but he nodded again. "Pocket, jacket." Naomi reached into the inside pocket of his suit coat and pulled out a small orange pill bottle. Her hands moved quickly but carefully. She opened the cap and placed a tablet under his tongue. "Let it dissolve," she said calmly. Around them, the guests watched in stunned silence. Naomi turned toward Douglas. "Call 911 and tell them he's having chest pain after a recent cardiac event." Douglas blinked. For a moment, he seemed frozen. "Now," Naomi said firmly. That snapped him out of it. Douglas hurried across the room toward the phone. Naomi knelt beside Richard, checking his pulse gently at his wrist. "Slow breaths," she told him quietly. "You're going to be okay." Richard's chest rose and fell unevenly. The room smelled faintly of spilled wine and polished wood, but Naomi's voice stayed steady. Outside the massive windows, Manhattan traffic continued moving, as if nothing unusual was happening 40 floors above the street. Sirens wailed somewhere far away, but Naomi focused only on the man in front of her. "Stay with me," she said softly. Richard nodded again. His breathing slowly began to stabilize. Within minutes, the distant sirens grew louder. Then red and blue lights flashed through the windows. Paramedics rushed through the elevator doors carrying medical bags. They quickly assessed the situation. One of them looked at Naomi. "You administered nitroglycerin?" "Yes." "And kept him seated?" "Yes." The paramedic nodded with approval. That probably prevented a full cardiac collapse." They placed oxygen around Richard's nose and helped him onto a stretcher. As they rolled him toward the elevator, Richard reached out weakly. "Wait." The paramedics paused. Richard turned his head toward Naomi. His voice was still rough. "You stayed calm." Naomi gave a small, reassuring smile. "My mom used to say panic never fixes anything." Richard studied her face for a moment longer before the stretcher rolled away into the elevator. The doors closed with a quiet, metallic click. The apartment suddenly felt empty. Guests whispered among themselves. The dinner party was clearly over. One by one, the investors began gathering their coats. Douglas stood near the window, still processing everything. Finally, he looked toward Naomi. "You knew what to do." Naomi shrugged lightly. "My mother works in hospital maintenance. I grew up around nurses." Douglas said nothing. For the first time since Naomi had stepped into the apartment, he seemed unsure of himself. Naomi quietly picked up a cloth and began wiping the table again. Broken glass had already been cleaned up. The room slowly returned to its polished perfection, but the atmosphere had changed. 2 hours later, Naomi stepped out of the building into the cool night air. A fine mist of rain drifted through the streetlights. The city glowed softly beneath it. She pulled her hoodie up again and began walking toward the subway entrance. Behind her, high above the street, the windows of the Caldwell penthouse reflected the lights of Manhattan. Meanwhile, across the city at Mount Sinai Hospital, Richard Caldwell lay in a quiet private room. Machines beeped softly beside the bed. A doctor reviewed the charts. "You're lucky," he said calmly. Richard stared at the ceiling. "How lucky?" "Very." The doctor closed the chart. "If the medication hadn't been given when it was, things could have been much worse." Richard turned his head slowly. "The girl," he said. "The maid." "Yes." "What's her name?" Richard answered without hesitation. "Naomi Brooks." The doctor nodded. "Well, Mr. Caldwell, Naomi Brooks may have just saved your life." Silence filled the hospital room. Outside the window, the lights of Manhattan shimmered like distant stars. Richard closed his eyes for a moment. The girl in the yellow hoodie, the quiet maid who fixed old radios, the woman who stayed calm while everyone else panicked. But for the first time in many years, Richard Caldwell felt something unexpected rising in his chest. Not fear, not anger, gratitude, and a growing curiosity about a woman he had barely noticed just a few days earlier. Because the more he thought about Naomi Brooks, the more he realized he knew almost nothing about her. And somehow he was certain that was about to change. 3 days later, the winter sky above Manhattan was a dull sheet of silver. Inside Mount Sinai Hospital, the quiet hum of medical machines filled Richard Caldwell's private recovery room. The smell of antiseptic lingered in the air, mixing with the faint scent of fresh coffee sitting untouched on the small table beside his bed. Richard stared out the window. Below him, the city moved as it always did, yellow taxis weaving through traffic, pedestrians crossing the avenues, steam rising from subway vents like ghostly clouds. New York never stopped. Not for anyone. Not even a billionaire recovering from a heart attack. The doctor had told him he would be discharged the following morning. "Less stress," the doctor repeated firmly. Richard had simply nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. They kept returning to the same image: a yellow hoodie, steady hands, a calm voice telling him to breathe. Naomi Brooks. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Douglas stepped into the room carrying a folder. "You're looking better, sir." Richard gestured toward the chair. "Sit down." Douglas sat stiffly. "I've already arranged your transportation home tomorrow," he said, "and I've instructed the staff to reduce your work schedule." Richard nodded slowly, and then he asked the question that had been on his mind all morning. "What do you know about Naomi Brooks?" Douglas hesitated. "The maid?" "Yes." Douglas shifted slightly in his chair. "She works through the cleaning agency, temporary assignment." "That's it?" Douglas shrugged. "That's all that matters." Richard studied him. "That's not what I asked." Douglas sighed quietly. "I looked into her background briefly after the incident. And she lives in the Bronx, lower income neighborhood. Works multiple cleaning jobs. Richard leaned back against his pillows. Anything else? Douglas paused again. There was something unusual. Richard waited. Douglas opened the folder and slid a printed page across the table. According to her employment records, she attended Hudson State University. Richard raised an eyebrow. Oh, what did she study? Douglas glanced down at the document. Data science. Richard blinked. Data science? Douglas nodded. She was apparently on a full academic scholarship. Richard sat up slightly. So, why is she cleaning apartments? Douglas closed the folder. She never finished the degree. Richard frowned. Why not? Douglas shook his head. The records only say she withdrew after her second year. Silence filled the room. Outside, the distant sound of a siren echoed between buildings. Richard tapped his fingers slowly on the arm of the chair. A scholarship student in data science, he said quietly. Yes. Who fixes radios? Douglas nodded reluctantly. And knows how to respond to a cardiac emergency. Yes. Richard looked toward the window again. Oh, that's not a coincidence. Douglas cleared his throat. Sir, with respect, people leave school all the time. Life happens. Richard said nothing, but his instincts told him there was more to Naomi Brooks than the simple explanation Douglas offered. The next afternoon, Richard returned to his penthouse. The city skyline stretched endlessly beyond the tall glass windows, glowing under the pale winter sunlight. Douglas walked beside him. The doctor said you should rest. Richard removed his coat slowly. I will. But rest didn't last long. Within an hour, he found himself sitting in the living room with a stack of company documents spread across the table. The newest project for Caldwell Systems had become a serious problem. So the company was developing a data platform designed to predict market behavior using real-time analytics. It had cost millions to build, and it wasn't working. The predictions were inconsistent. The investors were getting nervous. Richard stared at the complex graphs on the screen of his laptop. Something in the algorithm wasn't right. But no one had been able to identify the flaw. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across the floor when Naomi returned for her next cleaning shift. She stepped quietly into the apartment. Good afternoon, Mr. Caldwell. Richard looked up. Naomi. Douglas hovered nearby, watching the interaction carefully. Naomi walked toward the kitchen and began her usual routine. Richard tried to focus on the data in front of him, but the numbers blurred together. Finally, he leaned back in frustration. Naomi noticed. She carried a tray of clean glasses toward the cabinet when she glanced at the laptop screen. For just a moment. Then she froze. The graphs on the screen looked familiar, very familiar. She tried to keep walking, but something about the problem nagged at her mind. Richard noticed the pause. What is it? He asked. Naomi blinked. Nothing, sir. Richard studied her. You looked at the screen like you recognized something. Naomi hesitated. Douglas immediately stepped forward. That's enough curiosity for one day, he said sharply. Naomi lowered her eyes. Sorry. She turned away, but Richard wasn't finished. Wait. Naomi stopped. Richard gestured toward the laptop. What did you see? Douglas frowned. Sir, she's just... I asked her. Douglas fell silent. Naomi looked uncertain. It's probably nothing, she said quietly. Tell me anyway. Naomi stepped closer to the table and looked at the screen again. Her eyes moved across the lines of code, across the model output, across the error rate graph. Then she pointed gently to one section. This variable, she said. Richard leaned forward. What about it? Naomi spoke carefully. The model is weighting historical volatility too heavily. Richard stared at her. And, if you shift the weighting toward the short-term pattern instead, the prediction curve should stabilize. The room fell silent. Douglas looked confused. Richard's eyes narrowed. Why do you think that? Naomi shrugged slightly. Because the pattern repeats every 7 days. Richard quickly typed a few commands into the laptop. He adjusted the algorithm exactly where Naomi had pointed. Then he ran the model again. The program processed the data. 5 seconds passed. 10 seconds. Then the new graph appeared. The prediction curve smoothed instantly. Richard sat frozen. The error rate dropped by nearly 40%. He turned slowly toward Naomi. How did you see that so quickly? Naomi looked embarrassed. I used to work with models like that. Douglas stepped forward. You studied this? Naomi nodded slightly. A long time ago. Richard stared at her. The quiet maid in the yellow hoodie, standing in his living room, fixing billion-dollar problems like she was adjusting a loose wire in an old radio. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Finally, Richard leaned back in his chair. Well, he said slowly, that was unexpected. And somewhere deep in Douglas's mind, a new concern began forming. Because the girl he had dismissed as just another maid was starting to look like something very different. And that realization was about to cause problems for everyone in the room. For a long moment, the only sound inside the penthouse was the faint hum of the laptop. Richard Caldwell leaned forward in his chair, staring at the graph on the screen. The numbers had stabilized. The red error line that had been climbing for weeks had suddenly flattened. He ran the model again. The same result appeared. 40% improvement. Richard slowly turned toward Naomi. You saw that in 10 seconds. Naomi looked uncomfortable under his gaze. I just noticed the pattern, she said quietly. Douglas stepped closer, his expression tight. With respect, sir, he said. This is hardly the place for technical discussions. Richard ignored him. Naomi, he said, where exactly did you learn this? She hesitated. The room suddenly felt too quiet. Finally, she answered. I studied data science in college. Richard nodded. Hudson State. Naomi's eyes lifted slightly. You already know? Douglas cleared his throat. I mentioned it earlier. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. And you left school. Naomi nodded. My father died, she said softly. Construction accident. Richard's expression softened slightly. I'm sorry. My mom got sick around the same time. Someone had to work. The late afternoon sunlight stretched across the living room floor, painting long golden lines across the marble. Richard looked back at the laptop screen. You were good, he said. Naomi didn't answer. You didn't just notice a pattern, Richard continued. You understood the entire model. She gave a small shrug. I used to build them. Douglas shifted impatiently. Sir, if we're finished here, she still has work to do. Richard glanced toward him. Actually, I'd like Naomi to stay for a few minutes. Douglas's jaw tightened. As you wish. Naomi looked uncertain, but remained standing near the table. Richard turned the laptop slightly toward her. This system has been costing my company millions, he said. My engineers couldn't fix it. He tapped the screen. You adjusted it in one sentence. Naomi looked down. I didn't fix it completely. Richard raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? She pointed to another section of the code. The real issue might be here. Richard leaned closer. Douglas watched the scene with increasing discomfort. For the next 15 minutes, Naomi explained quietly how the algorithm might be improved. She spoke slowly, carefully choosing her words, almost as if she were afraid of saying too much. Richard listened without interrupting. By the time she finished, the room had grown completely silent again. Richard closed the laptop. "Well," he said quietly, "that was the most productive meeting I've had all week." Naomi gave a small, embarrassed smile. "I should probably get back to cleaning." Richard nodded. "Yes, of course." She turned and walked toward the kitchen. Douglas waited until she was out of earshot before speaking. "Sir, this is exactly what I warned about." Richard looked up. "Oh, what are you talking about?" Douglas lowered his voice. "People with nothing often look for opportunities." Richard's eyes hardened. "She didn't ask for anything. Not yet." Richard stood slowly. "You're making assumptions." Douglas met his gaze. "I'm protecting you." Richard didn't respond, but something in his expression suggested he wasn't convinced. The evening passed quietly. Naomi finished cleaning the apartment and left before sunset. Outside, Manhattan glowed beneath the deep blue sky of early evening. The wind carried the smell of roasted nuts from a street cart on the corner. Naomi walked toward the subway station, her mind still replaying the conversation in the penthouse. She hadn't meant to get involved. She knew better. Life had taught her one rule very clearly: stay invisible. People noticed you less that way. But today she had slipped. She had spoken without thinking. And now Richard Caldwell knew something about her past. The train ride to the Bronx felt longer than usual. By the time she reached her stop, the sky had turned dark. Streetlights flickered along the sidewalks. The neighborhood grocery store still glowed under bright fluorescent lights, and music echoed from a passing car. Naomi pulled her hoodie tighter and walked toward the church basement. Inside, volunteers were already preparing dinner for the evening meal program. Pastor Williams waved when he saw her. "Naomi, we saved you a bowl." "Thank you, Pastor." She helped serve food for the next hour, greeting the regulars who lined up along the tables. An elderly woman named Mrs. Garcia squeezed her hand. "You're always smiling," she said. Naomi laughed softly. "Somebody has to." But even as she spoke, Naomi's mind drifted back to the penthouse, to Richard's questions, to the laptop screen. Across the city, inside a sleek glass tower overlooking the Hudson River, several executives gathered in a conference room. They were senior investors in Caldwell Systems. Richard appeared on the video screen. "We may have found a solution to the prediction model," he said calmly. The room leaned forward. "How?" one investor asked. Richard hesitated for just a second. Then he answered, "A new perspective." The investors exchanged curious looks. Back in the penthouse, Douglas stood quietly near the doorway, listening. He knew Richard well, and he knew when something was beginning to change. Later that night, after the city had gone quiet, Naomi returned to the apartment building for her next cleaning shift. The elevator carried her once again toward the 40th floor. When the doors opened, she stepped into the familiar hallway. But before she could reach the penthouse door, voices drifted toward her from inside the apartment. The door wasn't completely closed. Two men were speaking inside the living room. One of them was Richard. The other voice belonged to a man Naomi didn't recognize. "We're running out of time," the man said. Richard sounded frustrated. "I know. If this system fails, the board could force a leadership change." Naomi froze just outside the door. "We need a breakthrough," the man continued. There was a pause. Then Richard said quietly, "I might have found one." Naomi's heart skipped. The stranger asked, "Where?" Richard hesitated again, and Naomi realized with sudden clarity that he was about to talk about her. She stepped back from the door quickly, because suddenly the quiet life she had been trying to live was about to collide with something much bigger, and Naomi Brooks wasn't sure she was ready for what might happen next. She stepped away from the penthouse door before either of the men inside could notice her standing there. The hallway felt colder than usual. Naomi waited a moment, steadying her breathing, then knocked gently as if she had just arrived. A second later, the door opened. Douglas stood there. His sharp gray eyes immediately narrowed. "You're late." "Subway delays," Naomi replied quietly. Douglas stepped aside. Inside the apartment, the atmosphere was tense. A man in a dark suit stood near the window speaking with Richard Caldwell. Naomi recognized him from business news clips. Victor Langley, one of the senior board members of Caldwell Systems. Victor glanced briefly at Naomi before returning his attention to Richard. "We'll talk tomorrow," he said in a low voice. Richard nodded. Victor grabbed his coat and walked toward the door. As he passed Naomi, he barely looked at her. To him, she was invisible. The elevator doors closed behind him with a soft metallic click. Silence settled over the apartment again. Douglas turned toward Naomi. "Kitchen first." "Yes, sir." Naomi walked quietly into the kitchen, but her mind was racing. She had heard enough to understand something important. Richard's company was in trouble, and somehow she had become part of the solution. She didn't want that. She couldn't afford that kind of attention. Her life already carried enough pressure. Back in the living room, Richard stood staring out the enormous glass window overlooking Central Park. The city lights flickered like scattered diamonds in the darkness below. Douglas approached him slowly. "You shouldn't encourage this situation." Richard didn't turn. "What situation?" "The maid." Richard finally faced him. "She has a name." Douglas folded his hands. "With respect, sir, someone from that background suddenly offering technical insight raises questions." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Questions about what?" Douglas spoke carefully. "Intentions." Richard studied him quietly for a moment. Then he said something Douglas didn't expect. She solved a problem my senior engineers couldn't solve." Douglas said nothing. Richard walked toward the bar and poured himself a glass of sparkling water. "I asked you to look into her background." "I did." "And?" Douglas hesitated. "There's more." Richard waited. Douglas opened a folder he had brought earlier and slid several documents onto the table. She wasn't just a scholarship student. Richard looked down. Hudson State University, Department of Data Science, GPA 3.9, academic honors. Richard scanned the papers. "Impressive." Douglas nodded reluctantly. "She was one of the top students in the program." Richard looked up. "Then why did she leave?" Douglas pulled out another document. "Her father." Richard read the short report. Michael Brooks, construction worker, fatal workplace accident 4 years earlier. Richard's expression darkened. "After that," Douglas continued, "her mother developed heart problems." Richard leaned back slowly. "Medical bills." "Yes." Douglas tapped the final page. "She withdrew from the university 2 months later." Richard sat quietly. Outside the window, a helicopter drifted across the night sky, its lights blinking red against the dark. "So she gave up a full scholarship," Richard said softly. "Yes. To take cleaning jobs." Douglas nodded. Richard exhaled slowly. Meanwhile, Naomi worked quietly in the kitchen. The faucet ran as she rinsed dishes. But her thoughts had drifted far away from the penthouse. She was remembering another building, Hudson State University. 4 years earlier, the campus had been full of life. Students rushing between classes, professors arguing over coffee, late nights in computer labs. Naomi had loved it there. Numbers made sense to her. Patterns revealed themselves like puzzles waiting to be solved. Her professors used to say she had a rare instinct for data modeling. But instincts didn't pay hospital bills. When her father died, everything had changed overnight. The scholarship covered tuition, but not rent, not food, not medical care. Naomi remembered sitting in the financial aid office while the counselor explained the situation. "You can apply for loans," the woman had said. Naomi had shaken her head. She already knew what the numbers looked like. Debt would bury them. So she packed her books into a cardboard box and left campus. She never told her classmates why. Well, back in the present, Naomi dried the final plate and placed it carefully on the rack. When she turned around, Richard Caldwell was standing in the doorway. She hadn't heard him walk in. "You were very good at it." Naomi blinked. "At what?" "Data science." She looked down. "I was okay." Richard stepped closer. "You were one of the best students in the program." Naomi looked surprised. "You checked?" Richard nodded. "I run a technology company. Checking information is part of the job." Naomi shifted uncomfortably. "You shouldn't worry about that." Richard leaned lightly against the counter. "Why not?" "Because it's in the past." Richard studied her face. "You gave up a lot." Naomi shrugged. "Life happens." There was no bitterness in her voice, just quiet acceptance. Richard found that strange. But most people in his world fought endlessly for advantage. Naomi had simply stepped aside. "Do you miss it?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded slightly. "Sometimes." The apartment grew quiet again. Douglas appeared at the doorway, watching the conversation carefully. Something about the scene bothered him. The billionaire, the maid, talking like equals. Douglas cleared his throat. "Sir, your evening medication." Richard nodded. "Thank you." Douglas handed him the small bottle and watched as he swallowed the pill. Then he looked toward Naomi. "Your shift ends in 10 minutes." "Yes, sir." Naomi finished wiping the counter and gathered her cleaning supplies. When she stepped toward the elevator, Richard followed her to the door. "Naomi." She turned. "Yes?" Richard spoke thoughtfully. You have a remarkable mind." She gave a small smile. "Thank you." The elevator arrived with a quiet ding. Naomi stepped inside. Just before the doors closed, Richard said one more thing. "If you ever wanted to return to that work, you could." Naomi shook her head gently. "That world moved on without me." The doors closed. The elevator began its descent toward the lobby. Richard stood in the hallway for a long moment. Behind him, Douglas watched with growing concern. Because the more Richard Caldwell learned about Naomi Brooks, the harder it was becoming to keep her invisible. And Douglas had a feeling that change was coming soon. A change that would disrupt everything inside the Caldwell household. He just didn't know how dangerous that change might become. The following morning, Manhattan woke under heavy clouds. Wind rattled the bare branches in Central Park, and a thin layer of frost clung to the sidewalks. Inside the Caldwell penthouse, the heating vents hummed softly, filling the enormous apartment with warm air. But the atmosphere inside was anything but warm. Douglas had been awake since dawn. He stood in the kitchen reviewing the household schedule, though his thoughts were clearly somewhere else. Richard Caldwell sat in the living room reading through financial reports on his tablet. His recovery from the hospital had slowed his movements, but his mind had already returned to the company's growing problems. Caldwell's Systems was under pressure. Investors were asking questions. Board members were watching closely. And the solution Richard had quietly discovered, the unexpected insight from Naomi Brooks, had only complicated matters. As Douglas stepped into the living room. "Sir?" Richard looked up. "Yes?" Douglas hesitated briefly. I believe the situation with Naomi Brooks should be reconsidered. Richard frowned. What situation? Douglas clasped his hands behind his back. The maid. Richard's expression hardened slightly. She saved my life. Douglas nodded, and that was appreciated. But? Richard asked. Douglas walked slowly toward the window. Your company is currently facing scrutiny from the board. Investors are nervous. Any appearance of unusual decision-making could raise questions. Richard leaned back in his chair. You think hiring a cleaning worker is unusual? Douglas turned toward him. I think allowing someone from outside your company to influence technical decisions could be misunderstood. Richard said nothing. Douglas continued. People might think she's manipulating the situation. Richard almost laughed. She didn't even want to talk about the system. That may be true, Douglas said carefully. But perception matters. The words hung in the air. Richard rubbed his temples slowly. He knew Douglas was thinking like a manager, protecting the household, protecting his employer's reputation. But something about the suggestion left a bitter taste in Richard's mouth. Let me handle my own decisions, Richard said finally. Douglas gave a small nod. Of course, sir. Later that afternoon, Naomi returned for her scheduled shift. Snow had begun falling lightly over Manhattan, drifting across the tall windows of the building. When she stepped into the penthouse, she noticed the atmosphere immediately. Douglas was waiting near the door. His posture was stiff. Naomi, he said. Yes, sir? We need to talk. Her heart sank slightly. Douglas led her toward the kitchen. Richard was not in the room. The silence felt heavier than usual. Douglas spoke without hesitation. Your services will no longer be required here. Naomi blinked. I'm sorry? The cleaning agency will assign someone else. Naomi stood very still. Did I do something wrong? Douglas shook his head. This is simply a management decision. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the living room. Does Mr. Caldwell know? Douglas answered calmly. He agreed. Those words landed harder than Naomi expected. For a moment she felt a sharp ache in her chest. Not anger, just disappointment. I understand, she said quietly. Douglas seemed slightly surprised by her calm reaction. You'll be paid through the end of the week. That's not necessary. She walked toward the counter and picked up her small cleaning bag. Outside the window, the snow continued falling softly over the city. Naomi paused for a moment before leaving the kitchen. Thank you for the opportunity, she said politely. Douglas nodded. You may collect your final check from the agency tomorrow. Naomi gave a small smile. All right. She walked toward the elevator. Inside the apartment, Richard Caldwell sat at his desk reviewing documents, unaware of the conversation that had just taken place. By the time he looked up again, Naomi Brooks was already gone. Outside, the snow had begun to cover the sidewalks. Naomi stepped onto the street and pulled her hoodie tighter around her head, but the cold air bit at her face as she walked toward the subway entrance. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out. The screen displayed a message from Bronx General Hospital. Reminder, payment due for surgery consultation. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. $60,000. The number felt heavier than ever. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and continued walking through the falling snow. Across town, inside the penthouse, Richard finished reviewing the company's latest financial reports. The numbers made his stomach tighten. The prediction system had failed again overnight. Another round of incorrect forecasts. Millions lost. Richard leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. He suddenly remembered Naomi standing beside the laptop days earlier, pointing to the code, fixing the error in seconds. He pressed a button on the desk phone. Douglas. Yes, sir? Where's Naomi today? There was a pause. Then Douglas answered. She won't be returning. Richard sat upright. What do you mean? I dismissed her this afternoon. The silence that followed felt colder than the snow outside. You what? Douglas stepped into the office doorway. I believed it was the best decision for the household. Richard's eyes darkened. You fired the woman who saved my life? Douglas spoke carefully. I removed a potential complication. Richard stood slowly. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he looked toward the window where snow drifted quietly across the skyline. And suddenly a terrible realization began to settle into his mind. But because the one person who might have been able to save his company was now walking somewhere through the streets of the Bronx. And Richard Caldwell had just lost her. Snow continued to fall over the city, soft and quiet, covering the sidewalks in a thin white layer that turned the streetlights into glowing halos. Naomi Brooks walked past a closed laundromat and a corner deli with flickering neon lights. The wind pushed snowflakes across her path, and the cold seeped through the fabric of her worn sneakers. She kept walking. Behind her, Manhattan's towers glowed faintly on the horizon like another world entirely. Her phone buzzed again in her pocket. Another hospital notification. She didn't look at it this time. Instead, she turned onto the narrow street where her apartment building stood. The brick walls were worn and faded, while the stair railings rusted from years of winter storms. Inside the building, the hallway lights flickered weakly. Mrs. Garcia from down the hall was sitting on a folding chair outside her door, wrapped in a thick sweater. You're home late again, Naomi, she said warmly. Naomi smiled. Work ran long. Mrs. Garcia nodded. You work too hard. Naomi laughed softly. Somebody has to. Upstairs in her small apartment, the air smelled faintly of medicine and peppermint tea. Her mother lay asleep on the couch, a blanket pulled up to her shoulders. The television played quietly in the background. The sound turned low. Naomi stepped closer and checked the pill bottles on the table. 3 left. Not enough. She sighed quietly and walked to the small desk near the window. Her laptop sat there, old but still working. For a long moment, Naomi simply stared at the screen. Then she opened it. Lines of code filled the monitor. Her code. The project she had started months earlier during late nights when she couldn't sleep. A predictive data model. Smaller than Caldwell Systems' system, but similar in design. Naomi leaned back in her chair. Her mind drifted back to the penthouse, to the moment she had seen Richard's algorithm on the laptop. The flaw had been obvious, too obvious. She opened a new window and began typing. Numbers and variables filled the screen. Time passed without her noticing. Outside the window, snow continued to fall across the Bronx. Meanwhile, 40 blocks south in Manhattan, Richard Caldwell stood in the center of his penthouse office staring at the latest financial report. The numbers were worse than before. Just the prediction model had collapsed again overnight. Investors were demanding answers. Victor Langley had already called twice. Richard closed the report and leaned against the desk. The memory returned again, Naomi's finger pointing to the screen. This variable, her quiet voice explaining the pattern. Richard pressed a button on his desk phone. Douglas. The house manager appeared moments later. Yes, sir? Richard spoke calmly. Find Naomi Brooks. Douglas blinked. Sir? I want to speak with her. Douglas hesitated. That may not be easy. Richard raised an eyebrow. Why? She works for an agency. They assign cleaners to multiple locations. She may already be scheduled somewhere else. Richard stepped toward the window. Then call the agency. Douglas nodded reluctantly and left the room. And 30 minutes later he returned. I spoke with Bright Home Cleaning. And? They confirmed Naomi Brooks is no longer working with them. Richard turned slowly. What do you mean? She left the agency this afternoon. Richard frowned. She quit? Douglas nodded. They said she turned down 3 new assignments. The news hit Richard harder than he expected. So she's unemployed. Douglas shrugged slightly. Possibly. Richard stared out the window again. Snow continued drifting across the city lights. Where does she live? Douglas handed him a small paper. Bronx, East 183rd Street. Richard looked down at the address. For a moment he said nothing. Then he picked up his coat. Douglas looked surprised. Sir? Richard walked toward the door. Cancel my evening meetings. You're going out? Richard opened the door. Yes. The elevator carried him down through the silent building. Outside, the cold air hit his face immediately. His driver stepped out of the black sedan. Mr. Caldwell? Bronx, Richard said. The driver hesitated for a moment, but nodded. The car pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the snowy Manhattan streets. Across the city, Naomi was still working at her desk. The glow of the laptop lit her small apartment. Lines of code filled the screen as her fingers moved across the keyboard. Her model began running simulations. Graphs appeared. Predictions stabilized. She leaned forward, adjusting another variable. The system improved again. Naomi exhaled slowly. It worked, but the solution she had suggested in Richard's penthouse wasn't just a guess. It was the beginning of something bigger. But she wasn't thinking about billion-dollar companies. She was thinking about hospital bills, about surgery, about her mother sleeping quietly across the room. Naomi saved the file and closed the laptop. Outside, a black sedan rolled slowly down her street. Richard Caldwell stepped out of the car and looked up at the aging brick apartment building. Snow gathered on the shoulders of his coat. He stared at the entrance for a long moment. Because somewhere inside that building lived the woman who had saved his life, and possibly the only person who could save his company. But Richard Caldwell had no idea that when he knocked on that door, he was about to discover the real reason Naomi Brooks had been working as a maid. And that truth would change everything. Snow continued drifting quietly over East 183rd Street as Richard Caldwell stepped out of the car. The Bronx felt very different from Manhattan. The buildings were older, the streetlights dimmer. A distant train rattled somewhere overhead, its metallic echo bouncing between brick walls. Richard stood on the sidewalk for a moment, studying the narrow apartment building in front of him. Paint peeled from the front door. A flickering bulb hung above the entrance, casting weak yellow light onto the icy steps. This was where Naomi Brooks lived. The driver remained inside the car, engine running, but Richard pulled his coat tighter against the cold and walked toward the entrance. Inside the building, the air smelled faintly of old wood and laundry detergent. A narrow staircase creaked under his weight as he climbed to the second floor. He checked the address Douglas had written down. Apartment 2B. Richard raised his hand and knocked gently. Inside the apartment, Naomi was rinsing dishes in the small kitchen sink. Her mother had woken up earlier and now sat on the couch, sipping tea, while an old sitcom played softly on television. The knock at the door surprised them both. Naomi dried her hands on a towel and walked toward the door. She opened it halfway. For a moment, she simply stared. Mr. Caldwell? Richard stood there, snowflakes melting on his coat. Good evening, Naomi. She looked confused. Oh, what are you doing here? Richard glanced briefly down the hallway. May I come in? Naomi hesitated. Then she stepped aside. The apartment was small but tidy. A second-hand couch sat against the wall, a stack of medical papers neatly arranged on the coffee table. Naomi's mother looked up from the television. Naomi, who is it? Naomi closed the door gently. This is Mr. Caldwell, she said. From work. Her mother smiled warmly. Well, come in. Anyone who knows my daughter is welcome. Richard nodded politely. Thank you, ma'am. He stepped further into the apartment, taking in the details quietly. The worn furniture, the medicine bottles on the table, the stack of hospital envelopes. None of it matched the image of the quiet maid who had calmly fixed a billion-dollar algorithm in his penthouse. Naomi folded her arms slightly. Did something happen? Richard met her eyes. I need your help. The words surprised her. With what? My company. Naomi blinked. Your company? Yes. Richard gestured toward the small kitchen table. May we sit? They sat across from each other. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Richard placed a printed report on the table. Our prediction system is failing. Naomi glanced at the papers. She recognized the graphs immediately. Richard continued. The adjustment you suggested helped, but it wasn't enough. Naomi studied the numbers quietly. Her mother watched the conversation with curiosity from the couch. Richard leaned forward. I believe you understand this system better than my engineers do. Naomi looked up. Oh, you shouldn't believe that. I've been in business 40 years, Richard said calmly. I know when someone understands something. Naomi looked down again. You fired me. Richard sighed. That decision was made without my knowledge. She raised an eyebrow slightly. But you didn't stop it. Richard didn't argue. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the stack of hospital papers on the table. What happened here? Naomi followed his gaze. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she answered quietly. My mom needs heart surgery. Her mother chuckled softly from the couch. Doctors say it's routine. Naomi shook her head gently. Routine if you can afford it. Richard picked up one of the envelopes. The number printed at the bottom made his expression tighten. $60,000. Oh, that's why you were working so many jobs, he said. Naomi nodded. Cleaning apartments pays quickly. You left college for this. My mom needed help. Her voice was calm. No anger, no resentment. Just a simple statement of fact. Richard leaned back slowly. You saved my life, he said. Naomi shrugged slightly. You were having a medical emergency. And you solved a problem that could save my company. Naomi didn't respond. Richard spoke carefully. I want you to come work for me. She looked up quickly. As what? A consultant. Naomi laughed softly. Your investors would love that. I'll handle the investors. She shook her head. You don't understand. Then explain. Naomi stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the snow continued falling over the quiet street. People like me don't get invited into rooms like yours, she said. Richard watched her carefully. I'm inviting you. Naomi turned back toward him. And when the board asks where you found your brilliant new consultant? Richard answered without hesitation. I'll tell them the truth. Silence filled the small apartment. Naomi's mother spoke from the couch. Naomi, she said gently. Naomi looked at her. Sweetheart, when opportunity knocks, you should at least open the door. Naomi smiled faintly. Then she turned back toward Richard. I'll think about it. Richard nodded. That's all I'm asking. He stood and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he paused. One more thing. Naomi waited. You didn't ask for anything when you helped me. She shrugged. You didn't need to. Richard opened the door. But I did, he said quietly. Outside, the cold wind swept snow across the street again. Richard stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind him. As he walked down the stairs, he felt something unusual rising in his chest. Not pressure, not pain, hope. Because for the first time in weeks, Richard Caldwell believed his company might survive. But he also knew something else. If Naomi Brooks agreed to help him, the world she had carefully stayed invisible within would never be the same again. The next morning, the snow had stopped. Sunlight reflected off the rooftops of the Bronx, turning the thin layer of snow into a bright white sheet that covered the streets. Naomi stood by the small kitchen window holding a cup of coffee, watching people shovel sidewalks below. Her mother sat at the table, tea slowly flipping through the morning mail. "You didn't sleep much," her mother said gently. Naomi smiled faintly. "I had a lot to think about." Her mother folded one of the letters and looked at her. That man seemed serious. He was. And Naomi looked down into her cup. "He wants me to help save his company." Her mother raised an eyebrow. "Well, that sounds important." Naomi laughed quietly. "Important doesn't always mean possible." Her mother leaned back in her chair. "You've been solving problems since you were 10 years old. Remember the time you fixed the church computer when the technician couldn't?" Naomi shrugged. "That was different." Her mother smiled. "Was it?" Naomi didn't answer. Instead, she looked again at the laptop sitting on the desk nearby. Her unfinished model still glowed on the screen, on numbers, patterns, possibilities. Finally, Naomi took a breath. "I'll go talk to him." Her mother nodded approvingly. "Good." Across the city, Richard Caldwell was already inside the glass headquarters of Caldwell Systems. The building overlooked the Hudson River, its reflective windows catching the morning sun. Inside the main conference room, several board members sat around a long, polished table. Victor Langley stood near the screen, reviewing financial projections. "The system failure has already cost us nearly $80 million, he said. Murmurs spread around the room. Richard sat quietly at the end of the table. "We're close to a solution," he said. Victor looked skeptical. "You said that yesterday." Richard didn't respond immediately. Then he said something that made the entire room pause. "I'm bringing in someone new." Victor frowned. "From where?" Richard answered calmly. "Outside the company." A few board members exchanged looks. Victor folded his arms. "You're hiring a consultant during a crisis?" "Yes." "Who?" Richard opened his mouth to answer. Just as the conference room door opened, Douglas stepped inside quietly. "Sir." Richard turned. "There's someone here to see you." Victor sighed impatiently. "This meeting is not open to visitors." Douglas looked slightly uncomfortable. "She insisted." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Who?" Douglas stepped aside, and Naomi Brooks walked into the room. She wore the same yellow hoodie and a dark winter coat. Snow still clung lightly to her boots. The contrast between her and the polished executives around the table was impossible to miss. The room fell silent. Victor looked confused. "Who is this?" Richard stood slowly. "This," he said calmly, "is Naomi Brooks." Several board members stared at her. Victor glanced toward Douglas. "Is this a joke?" Douglas looked equally uncomfortable. Naomi felt every pair of eyes on her. For a moment she considered turning around and walking out. But then she remembered the hospital bill on her kitchen table and her mother's quiet smile. So she stepped forward. Richard gestured toward the presentation screen. "Naomi discovered the flaw in our prediction system." Victor laughed lightly. "You're telling me the cleaning staff solved our algorithm problem?" Naomi kept her voice calm. "You're overweighting historical volatility." The room grew quiet again. Victor's smile faded slightly, but Naomi walked toward the screen and picked up the presentation remote. "Your model assumes the market behaves the same across long-term cycles," she continued. Several engineers in the room leaned forward. Naomi pressed a button. The graph appeared on the screen. But the pattern actually resets every 7 days. She highlighted a section of the data. If you adjust the model to prioritize short-term pattern repetition, the prediction curve stabilizes. Victor crossed his arms. And how do you know that? Naomi typed quickly on the nearby laptop. The model recalculated. The updated graph appeared. The error rate dropped dramatically. The room went silent. One of the engineers whispered, "That's impossible." Another shook his head slowly. "No, she's right." Victor stared at the screen. But for the first time that morning, he looked uncertain. Richard leaned back slightly. "I believe we've found our solution." The engineers quickly began discussing the adjustment. Numbers flew across the screens. Simulations ran. Every result confirmed Naomi's theory. Victor slowly turned toward Richard. "And this woman works for you?" Richard smiled slightly. "She will." Naomi looked surprised. Richard stepped forward. "Naomi Brooks will be joining Caldwell Systems as a senior consultant on this project." The room buzzed with conversation. Some executives looked impressed. Others looked skeptical. But the results on the screen were undeniable. Victor Langley studied Naomi carefully. Finally, he spoke. "Well," he said slowly, "looks like you've just saved us $80 million. Naomi gave a small smile. I just noticed the pattern." Richard glanced at her, but he knew the truth. This wasn't luck. It was brilliance. And as the meeting continued, Richard Caldwell realized something remarkable. The young woman everyone had dismissed as just a maid was about to become the most important person in the room. For several seconds, no one spoke. The giant screen at the front of the conference room still displayed Naomi's corrected model. The prediction line flowed smoothly across the chart, steady and confident. $80 million saved, possibly much more. Victor Langley leaned forward slowly, resting both hands on the table. "Run the simulation again," he said. One of the engineers nodded and entered a new command. Numbers scrolled across the screen. Another projection appeared. The result was the same. Then a third simulation. Again, the model held steady. Murmurs spread around the room. One of the senior engineers shook his head in disbelief. "We've been trying to solve this for 6 weeks." Another quietly added, "She fixed it in 5 minutes." Naomi stood near the screen, her hands folded in front of her. The bright conference lights reflected softly against the glass walls behind her. She felt every pair of eyes in the room watching her. Some curious, some impressed, some still doubtful. Victor slowly leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said, "it appears we have underestimated our new consultant." Richard Caldwell allowed himself a small smile. "That happens sometimes." Victor studied Naomi carefully. "What did you say your position was again?" Naomi answered honestly. "I was cleaning Mr. Caldwell's apartment." A few people shifted awkwardly in their chairs. Victor raised his eyebrows. "Was?" Richard spoke calmly. "That job ended yesterday." Victor nodded slowly. "Well then, Miss Brooks, welcome to Caldwell Systems." The tension in the room softened slightly, but Naomi remained quiet. The meeting continued for another hour as engineers worked with Naomi to integrate her correction into the system. Each test confirmed the same thing. The algorithm now worked perfectly. When the meeting finally ended, the board members filed out of the room one by one. Victor paused beside Richard before leaving. "You always did have unusual instincts," he said quietly. Richard glanced toward Naomi across the room. "This time I was just lucky." Victor chuckled. "Or maybe you're getting better at recognizing talent." When the room emptied, Naomi sat down slowly at the long table. The adrenaline of the moment began fading. Richard walked over and placed a glass of water in front of her. "You did well." Naomi smiled faintly. "I was terrified." Richard laughed softly. "You didn't show it." She looked toward the massive windows overlooking the river. "I've never been in a room like that before." "You handled it better than most executives I know." Naomi exhaled slowly. For the first time since she had walked into the building that morning, the pressure in her chest eased. Richard pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "There's something else we should discuss." Naomi looked curious. "What's that?" Richard slid a folder across the table. Inside were several documents, but Naomi opened it carefully. Her eyes widened as she read the first page. "Equity Partnership Agreement." Richard nodded. "If this project succeeds, and it will, your work will be responsible for it." Naomi looked up. "I didn't do it alone." "But you solved the problem." She read further down the page. "A percentage of company shares." Her hands froze. "Mr. Caldwell, this is fair." Naomi shook her head. "This is life-changing." Richard smiled gently. "That's the point." Naomi closed the folder slowly. For several seconds she couldn't speak. All the long nights cleaning apartments, all the subway rides home in the cold, all the times people had looked at her and assumed she didn't belong. And now she was sitting in a glass tower overlooking Manhattan, being offered ownership in a technology company, and it didn't feel real. Finally, she looked at Richard again. "Why?" Richard didn't hesitate. "Because talent deserves opportunity." Naomi's voice softened. "You barely knew me." Richard smiled. "You saved my life." She laughed quietly. "That's not a business strategy." "No," he said. "It's something more important." Weeks passed. The corrected system launched successfully. Caldwell Systems' prediction platform became the most accurate model in the industry within months. Investors returned. The company's value soared. And 1 year later, the glass auditorium at Caldwell Systems headquarters filled with reporters, investors, and employees. Bright lights flashed across the stage. Richard Caldwell stepped to the podium. Behind him stood Naomi Brooks. She wore a simple navy suit now, and her yellow hoodie long replaced, but the calm confidence in her eyes was the same. Richard addressed the crowd. "1 year ago, our company faced the greatest challenge in its history." He paused. "And the solution came from someone most of us would have overlooked." He turned toward Naomi. "Today, I'm proud to introduce the newest co-founder of Caldwell Systems." Applause erupted through the room. Some of the same executives who had once doubted her now stood and clapped. Naomi stepped forward to the microphone. The lights were bright. The room was full. But she remained calm. She thought about her mother watching from the front row, about the small apartment in the Bronx, about the long road that had brought her here. Naomi looked out across the crowd and smiled gently. "Sometimes," she said, "the greatest investment you can make is kindness." The room grew quiet, because every person there understood the truth behind those words. A billionaire who once believed she was just a maid had discovered something far more valuable. And Naomi Brooks, the woman who never stopped helping others, even when she had nothing, had finally been seen for who she truly was. A quiet act of kindness had changed 2 lives, and in the process, it had changed everything. Now I'd love to hear from you. If you believe kindness still matters in this world, type 1 in the comments. If you think Naomi deserved everything that happened to her, type 2. And if you believe one small act of kindness can truly change someone's life, just type 0. Your comment helps this story reach more people who might need to hear it today. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because right here, we share real stories about courage, kindness, and the moments when someone everyone overlooked changes everything. Stay with us for the next story. You never know which life might be transformed next.